This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Connecticut has a lot of nicknames, but Corrupticate really sticks, thanks to a number of former politicians. Today, Where We Live, we focus on the latest corruption story in our state. It involves a Bridgeport politician, one of several from the Park City who've been arrested on federal corruption charges. State Senator Dennis Bradley, a Democrat and an attorney, has been accused of allegedly attempting to defraud nearly $180,000 from the state's Clean Elections program. Yeah, I can picture a lot of you shaking your heads right about now. Coming up, we'll talk about this story with longtime Bridgeport reporter Brian Lockhart from Hearst, Connecticut Media. We'll also talk to a Bridgeport resident who leads a grassroots community action group. Jameem Davis is co-director of Bridgeport Generation Now. We'll hear from her in a little bit. Now, are you a Bridgeport resident? You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. First up on Zoom is Brian Lockhart, a reporter covering Bridgeport for the Connecticut Post and Hearst, Connecticut newspapers. Brian, welcome back to the show.
Hi, good morning, Lucy.
So the latest corruption story again involving State Senator Dennis Bradley. Tell us about the charges he's facing and when did these alleged crimes take place?
So he was arrested last week along with his campaign manager. And these allegedly took place in March of 2018. He had a party at that time where he raised some money for his ultimately successful state Senate bid that year. And allegedly, he basically kept details of this party and how he funded it, how he helped to fund it, and also how much he raised from the State Elections Enforcement Commission. They are the folks that he would have applied to in order to obtain clean public campaign financing, a grant for his primary and then a subsequent grant for his general election in 2018. And so basically he's alleged to have purposefully misled them in terms of the party being essentially a campaign fundraiser, because there are lots of hoops that candidates have to jump through when they apply for the public financing. And so that's what got him in trouble.
So the indictment accuses him of filing false documents to obtain that primary grant, Brian?
Yes. So basically, he is alleged to have used personal funds for the party and also to have falsified records of the donations that he received that night in order to cover it up. Basically, he at the time was arguing that it was a party put on by his law firm where he happened to announce that he was running for state senate. And the SEC is very strict in terms of the rules that lawmakers and candidates have to follow in order to apply for the clean public financing grants.
We'll be talking more about that program coming up later with the Connecticut Mirror's Mark Pasniokis. But I understand, in addition to these federal charges, Dennis Bradley's under investigation by the State Elections Board for a separate complaint. Can you talk about that related to text messages?
Yeah, that complaint stems back to some text messages that Bradley allegedly sent back in 2017. So at that time, he was contemplating his 2018 run for state senate. And there was a Democratic candidate for mayor of Stratford. Now, Bradley's district includes a portion of Stratford. So allegedly in those texts, Bradley committed to contributing $5,000 to this mayoral candidate's campaign in exchange for a handful of things he was looking for, one of which would be some sort of a job should she be elected. She wanted him to campaign. She wanted her to campaign with him in sections of Stratford. But in particular, he wanted the job because he said in the text he wanted to kind of get to know the people. And this was obviously something that he felt he needed to do in order to have a successful Senate campaign. Now, I need to be clear that these text messages, the folks that he was interacting with, this particular mayoral candidate and some of her supporters, they rebuffed him. They scolded him for what they thought was an inappropriate text. This complaint was filed by his opponent for the Senate primary, a gentleman named Aaron Turner. So Aaron Turner faced off with Dennis Bradley in 2018 in the Democratic state Senate primary. Turner lost to Bradley, and Turner filed this complaint, and this complaint is still pending with the SEC.
Now, you've written about Dennis Bradley. For people outside of the Bridgeport area who may not know a lot about him, your story compared him to Cory Booker. So tell us, who is Dennis Bradley? Where did he come from?
Well, I should say he compared himself to Cory Booker.
Okay.
So he showed up in Bridgeport around the late 2000s, 2008, 2009. He came from Massachusetts, and he pretty quickly got involved in local politics. He volunteered for Congressman Jim Himes, for a pair of Congressman Jim Himes campaigns, and then he was hired as a staffer in one of Himes' local offices. So he was doing outreach, particularly immigrant outreach in Bridgeport and also in Stamford. Started his law firm around that time as well, and then quickly began trying to run for office. So he ran unsuccessfully for state rep in 2014. He did win a seat on the school board in 2015, and he became chairman of the school board in Bridgeport from 15 through 16. And he remained on the school board for about 4 years. In the meantime, he tried to run for state senate in 2016 and lost. And then he finally won his legislative seat, his current Senate seat, in 2018. And he's an interesting guy because he is, for all intents and purposes, an outsider. He's not born and raised in Bridgeport. And yet there are a lot of longtime veteran politicians in the city who really like him. He's 37. They feel he's this, he has a lot of potential. A lot of people I interviewed last week, they said, he really does, on the face of it, seem to be the perfect candidate. Polished, well-dressed, well-spoken, good-looking. He's an attorney. He's bilingual. And there are folks who really felt that he would sort of bridge the divide as a candidate in Bridgeport between Hispanic and Black residents, and potentially that would make him a very good mayoral candidate in a couple of years, in 2023.
Brian, I wanted you to build more on that when we talk about the way Bridgeport works, the political machine, a lot of insiders that dictate, who's going to be running and who you should support. What is it about Dennis Bradley that, as an outsider, he was able to be elected and, also held some pretty prominent positions in the legislature until these charges came out, and now he's lost those positions. Tell us more about him.
Yeah, I think it is what I said, that he has, on the face of it, everything that it takes to be a very good candidate. And I think that's what attracted a lot of folks to him. He's an affable guy. He's a little quirky. Some people I know find him a bit arrogant in how he carries himself. But they're always looking for sort of the next up and coming politician in Bridgeport. And it does make him unique because he was not born and raised here. And yet folks have gravitated to him. And, I was talking last week. Certainly this is a big blow to his political career. But as we have seen a few times in Bridgeport, you can actually get convicted of federal charges and still come back and revive your political career. Mayor Joe Ganim did it. Bernie Newton did it. He's a fallen state legislator who is currently serving on the city council. So I wouldn't say it's the end of Dennis Bradley's political career in Bridgeport, although it certainly does hurt it for the time being.
So talk us through the reaction from the Bridgeport community. Let's talk about what you've heard, not only from his supporters, but his detractors when this news came out that he was arrested.
Sure. So there are certainly people who, as you mentioned, when you said, there's probably people in the audience rolling their eyes. There are certainly people in Bridgeport who are just feeling exasperated by this. Dennis was arrested, and his campaign manager, Jessica Martinez, they were arrested last Tuesday. Around that same time last week, our former police chief and our former personnel director were reporting to federal prison to begin their sentences for the last federal corruption scandal that Bridgeport weathered, which was the two of them helped the former police chief cheat to get his job back in 2018. So they got caught and they got sent to prison. And the days that, I believe Chief went to prison on Monday. So the following day, Dennis Bradley gets arrested, unrelated charges, but it does get exasperating for people, and they get frustrated with this. There are certainly people that do not like Dennis Bradley. They think he's an opportunist. If you noticed when I was talking about his campaigns, he ran for state rep in 2014, lost, ran for the school board in 2015, won, and then in 2016 ran for state senate. So there were some folks who were frustrated with him back then because he ran for the school board and then immediately the following year turned his sights back to running for the legislature. So there are people who think he's an opportunist and certainly feel like he's getting what he deserves. There are other people who really like him. As I said, they think he could have been a potential mayoral contender in 2023. And one of the things that's interesting is there is this, and I'm not saying this is correct or not, but it's just a feeling that some people have. I know that some folks in the community, they look at him and they look at, for example, Ernie Newton, who got in trouble with the SEC a few years ago as well. He weathered that scandal. That was the second scandal for Mr. Newton. But Mr. Newton is Black. Dennis, I believe, is Black and Hispanic. And so there are some folks in Bridgeport I talked to last week who feel like these folks are being targeted, that minority politicians are being targeted. And so they're not angry with Dennis Bradley. They're angry with the SEC. They're angry with the federal authorities. They're angry with the charges that have been brought against him. They feel that they're being singled out. They feel that these are unfair. And so there's sort of they feel that there is some sort of a racial component.
You mentioned Mayor Ganim. What has Mayor Ganim said about this arrest?
He's been pretty quiet about it. He did not issue any sort of a statement on the day of the arrests, and we finally got him to issue a statement last Wednesday. But there wasn't much to it. He essentially claimed that this was a surprise, that his administration, his office, he was not aware of this. They were just learning about it like everyone else. And which honestly is very difficult to believe because at least since early 2020, in the weeks prior to the pandemic, there were lots of rumors going around about a grand jury having convened to look at Dennis Bradley. So this has actually been out there for a while. There were folks in the community, folks involved in politics in Bridgeport, who I understand were being interviewed by the grand jury over the course of last year. So it's hard to believe that the mayor and his top aides weren't aware that something was brewing. I do think it can be kind of difficult for him because he went through his own corruption scandal during his first administration. He ran the city from 91 until 2003. He was convicted in 2003 of, I believe it was 16 counts of federal corruption, and he was reelected in 2015. I do think sometimes it can be difficult for him to wade in on this kind of stuff because to a certain extent, he doesn't necessarily have the moral authority that a politician that has not been convicted of corruption has. So I think whenever something like this happens in Bridgeport, it can be kind of tough for the mayor to issue really tough statements because there's certainly going to be some folks who are going to look to his past and say, well, you were convicted of corruption too. So I think for him, his policy is he's just going to try and stay out of it and avoid wading into the issue too much.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. With us on Zoom, Brian Lockhart, reporter covering Bridgeport for the Connecticut Post and Hearst, Connecticut newspapers, as we learn more about the corruption charges that State Senator Dennis Bradley faces. Coming up, we hear from a community leader about what this latest scandal involving a Bridgeport politician means for the city. Now, we did reach out to Dennis Bradley's lawyer, James Glasser. In a statement, he wrote, "On behalf of Senator Bradley and myself, I would simply say we look forward to meeting the charges in court. We have great confidence in our judicial system and look forward to vindication at the close of the process. You can join our conversation. We'll be back after a short break. Here's the number, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about Bridgeport today after another politician from the city, State Senator Dennis Bradley, faces federal corruption charges. You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. With us on Zoom is Brian Lockhart, a longtime reporter covering Bridgeport for the Connecticut Post and Hearst, Connecticut newspapers. Now, a few years ago, some residents formed a social action network to encourage the Bridgeport community to be engaged in local politics and to fight for change, especially clean elections in Connecticut's largest city. Joining us now on Zoom is Jameen Davis. She's co-director of Bridgeport Generation Now. That's a nonpartisan grassroots group that promotes civic engagement. Jameen, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So your group promotes good governance. What was your reaction when Senator Bradley was arrested the other week?
Well, for me, I am born and raised in Bridgeport and have been actively, working with Bridgeport Generation Now since 2017. And honestly, I was heartbroken for our city. We have suffered under systemic corruption for way too long, and it was a setback for our city. So I was heartbroken for what has happened and also angry. People seem to think that they can come to Bridgeport and do whatever they want. It feels like the wild, wild west in politics here, where people come to extract from the community, take what they want, what they need, don't follow the rules, and then claim victim and face no consequences or very little consequences. So just completely angry, saddened.
Beyond the arrest of Senator Bradley, the former chair of Bridgeport School Board also indicted Jessica Martinez, and she was Bradley's campaign treasurer. So what's your reaction to that when I think about, a lot of what's been going on in the city of Bridgeport over the years, looking at how the school board even functions, and you have somebody that's also been indicted related to this story?
Yeah, well, what is the big problem here is that because of systemic corruption, people who are elected don't really truly get the support of the community when they're elected. So we have a very strong political class who just picks and chooses who they want to be in these seats, and they rig elections through absentee ballot abuse and fraud. I'm not saying that that's exactly what happened with Jessica Martinez, but it certainly is there's a culture of corruption here. And unfortunately, with her, I don't know what's going on with her personally, but it didn't seem like she was a stable person to be in that seat in the first place. She just a few years ago, there was also a scandal around her and some drug abuse, things of that nature. And she has always been very, very, very supportive of Dennis Bradley. So, so much so that people can't see anymore, like when people do the wrong thing. It's almost like a mob mentality, or cultish. It's very cultish. When someone does something that they are absolutely not supposed to do, the political class doesn't hold them accountable to anyone. And they say things like, oh, he's a good guy, or she's a good guy, or she's a good woman, just got caught up, when in fact, these people are making choices, and it's their responsibility to uphold their responsibilities and their duty to the people of Bridgeport.
Jameen, when you talk about the political class, does that also include some voters who reelect individuals like Mayor Ganim, who went to prison on corruption charges? I believe Ernie Newton also, after his crime, after he served time, was reelected to city council, if I'm getting that right. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about how voters continue to give second chances to people who abuse the public trust.
I think voters aren't to blame in this case. I think we are presented with choices, and we are presented with those choices based on the power that is concentrated in the Democratic Town Committee. And the Democratic Town Committee is made up of people who essentially are captured by the system, of patronage. And so they put forth people. And then because we are a majority Democratic city, lots of people, not just in Bridgeport, but all around the country, kind of vote the party line because that's what people think that they should do. And in fact, that on top of the absentee ballot abuse that happens here really ensures that the people of Bridgeport and our will is not is thwarted, right? So, and for instance, when Marilyn Moore ran for mayor, she won at the polls. The majority of the people in the city who were voting actually did want her. And then we found out that this absentee ballot machine, ramped up, and that is how she lost by 200 and something votes. So I would push back and say it's not really the voters' fault. It is the political class, it is political patronage, and it is straight up corruption.
You mentioned Senator Marilyn Moore. I just wanted to be transparent. You were the one who also worked on her campaign when she was trying to run for mayor?
Yes, I did. I came onto her campaign in the middle of that campaign. Yes, I did.
I wanted to get Brian Lockhart to give us some context because a couple times, Jameen, you've mentioned the absentee ballot issue and the strong Democratic political machine in the city. So, Brian, give us some more context on what Jameen is talking about.
Well, and it is interesting because after what everything that we went through last year, probably absentee ballots are probably more popular than ever in Connecticut and certainly around the country. But yeah, there's been several examples in Bridgeport over the years of politicians getting in trouble for absentee ballot abuses and essentially turning out the vote through absentee ballots. And for years, that has been viewed, frankly, not just in Bridgeport, but in a lot of the larger cities as a way to guarantee a certain amount of votes. So, campaigns know this stuff inside and out. So if they're losing on the machines or they're not doing well on the in-person voting, they know that they have a whole bunch of absentee votes banked. And certainly this came to the forefront in 2019 in the very bitter mayoral contest between incumbent Joe Ganim and State Senator Marilyn Moore, where she did very well on the voting machines, on the in-person voting during that year's mayoral primary, but Ganim ultimately prevailed using absentee ballots. And that is another State Elections Enforcement Commission investigation, which is still pending. I understand it's still pending, that it was slowed down by the pandemic, but they were looking into allegations of absentee ballot abuses by the Ganim campaign at that time. So certainly after absentee balloting became more popular last year, I do think some folks are rethinking it. As Jameen said, there's absentee balloting, and then there's abusing the absentee ballot system. So there is still cause for concern and to keep an eye out on those things. I will just say one other thing is, while we're talking about Marilyn Moore, Marilyn Moore is sort of considered the reform candidate in Bridgeport, the good government candidate in Bridgeport. She has been absolutely silent on Dennis Bradley's arrest. So she's his co-senator. We have two senators from Bridgeport, Marilyn Moore and Dennis Bradley, and she has been silent. We have tried by phone, we have tried in person to interview her about her thoughts on him, and she just will not make any comments about it, which I do think is interesting because, again, she is the good government candidate. So you would think of all the Bridgeport politicians, she would be sort of fearless in commenting on this situation, but she's not.
Jamim, what do you think about that, not hearing from Senator Moore? Or even, I'm just wondering what you've heard from other people in power that represent Bridgeport, whether it's in the city or at the Connecticut General Assembly. I mean, what's their take? Another scandal that doesn't make Bridgeport look very good to the rest of our state, and that can be problematic because it's been an ongoing thing.
Yeah, I certainly can't speak for Marilyn Moore or anyone else. What I can say is that generally, it's a feeling of, oh no, here we go again. And how are we going to fix this? I don't think that is an easy question to answer. Well, there certainly is no quick fix, right? So it's going to take efforts not just in Bridgeport, but outside of Bridgeport, to bring more attention to the problem we have here, which is, we're basically, our democracy has been gutted. And so we have to work inside of Bridgeport, with groups like mine, Bridgeport Generation Now, and our affiliate, Bridgeport Generation Now Votes, have to do our work. We have to go deeper. We have to talk about the issues here, and we have to insist that our municipality and our state and federal laws address the concerns of Bridgeport residents, especially around this issue.
Jamim Davis is co-director of Bridgeport Generation Now here on Where We Live, as well as Brian Lockhart, who's a reporter covering Bridgeport for the Connecticut Post and Hearst, Connecticut newspapers, as we talk about this latest politician from the Bridgeport-area, State Senator Dennis Bradley, who faces federal corruption charges, allegedly trying to defraud the state's Clean Elections Fund to help candidates run. You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Jamim, you told me that you can't speak for people like Senator Moore and others, but are you hearing from people that are defending Dennis Bradley? Brian sharing earlier that some residents that he's spoken with see Dennis Bradley's story as the feds are targeting him because of his race. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have heard from people in the political class who are defending Dennis Bradley, because they like him. That is also another problem here. If you like someone, then, they can do no wrong. I think that, what Dennis Bradley has allegedly done is outrageous. And I am disappointed that people refuse to see when our local politicians and that our representatives abuse our trust. And Dennis Bradley needs to take responsibility for that, and take responsibility for just, and put it this way. Dennis Bradley needs to take responsibility for what he has done. The political class here needs to take responsibility for their behavior, in that they will always, claim that something is one way when it really is another. They circle around people that they like, instead of holding people accountable. And I think that is a disservice to the people of Bridgeport.
And Lucy, if I could just jump in quick, talk in terms of, Dennis Bradley being accountable. I mean, we should know that. So the SEC did withhold a campaign grant from him. So he did back in 2018, when this was all being investigated, when this initial kickoff party, this launch party was being investigated. He did obtain his initial primary campaign grant from the SEEC. He was subsequently, however, denied a campaign grant for that fall's general election. And I interviewed Mr. Bradley at the time, and looking back at it, he was not apologetic. He threatened to sue the SEC at that particular time. So publicly at that time, he was very combative over this very issue with the SEC and claiming that he had done nothing wrong and that he deserved this this grant. So I just felt I should mention that.
You can join our conversation as we continue to talk about this latest corruption story in our state, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Jimmy, I wanted to go back to your story about, you'd mentioned that you had moved away. You're from Bridgeport, you moved away, you came back. But to talk more about what Bridgeport stands to lose when, again, there's another political scandal. We think about the challenges that your city faces and the real need for strong leadership.
Mm-hmm. Well, what our city loses is opportunity. So there's economic opportunity. People don't come to Bridgeport to start businesses and to invest in Bridgeport because people do not trust our city government. They don't trust our elected officials. We lose socially, like people leave Bridgeport because our school system is not funded equitably. Our streets are not paved. In the East End, it's often very dirty. We lose a lot economically, socially. People don't invest. Our downtown right now looks like a ghost town most of the time. And I live here. I live right downtown on Main Street, and there's not that much going on. Businesses come, or little entrepreneurs have startups, and then they're not able to sustain those startups because there's always issues with like permits, city government. Our reputation is just so bad and so unequitable. And there's this sense of, you've got to pay to play here in Bridgeport that keeps people away. So unless and until we fix our corruption problem, which is real, our image, Bridgeport is going to stay stagnant.
Brian, again, you've covered the city of Bridgeport for some time. What's the responsibility when we think about how the delegation advocates for the city of Bridgeport, the Bridgeport delegation? How does the governor's office and the state capitol view the city of Bridgeport?
Well, the unfortunate thing is that I think, so when Mayor Ganim was reelected in 2015, there was certainly a lot of concern. I mean, there was a big effort at that time by some Democrats, I should say, not just in Bridgeport, but around the state, to try and keep him from winning re-election. The last few years, I think the economy in Bridgeport has gotten better. Things have gotten better. I mean, part of that is that the city has been so behind in terms of has kind of been left behind in terms of economic development for so long that it's one of the last places in Connecticut where businesses are discovering it, developers are discovering it, investors are discovering it. And so it has that going for it. But when you have an issue like this, and when you have a situation like we mentioned with the police chief, Jamim is right. I think that it potentially can scare people off. I think it's just this feeling of sort of being unsettled. It's kind of like, well, do I want to invest in this city? How do I know another shoe isn't going to drop in another couple months? How do I know another politician or official isn't going to be charged with something in the next few months? But I think, look, it's the biggest city in the state. It's a Democratic city. The governor has to work with it. The legislature has to work with it. And I do think they want to. I mean, there are a lot of good people in Bridgeport. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's like Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, there's There are a lot of good people in Bridgeport trying their best and doing their best. And I think it's sort of just this feeling of onward and upward, okay, we just got to get through this. I know the legislative delegation in these final days, they're frustrated because Mr. Bradley was sort of an unreliable vote last week. He wasn't showing up, and they had not heard from him if he was going to actually show up for votes. He did make a return appearance Thursday evening, I believe. So that uncertainty was frustrating for them, but otherwise for them, they've said it's kind of nose to the grindstone. They're just going to keep doing their work and keep doing their job. The governor's not going to ignore Bridgeport. This could be sort of a setback behind the scenes in terms of things Mr. Bradley was working on, but the governor certainly is not going to ignore Bridgeport.
I wanted to end with you, Jamim Davis. We talked about the challenges and, again, the work that Bridgeport Generation Now has been doing. What would you say to young people who might be thinking of leaving your city to convince them that they should stay and help make the changes that you're talking about?
Well, we're the only, we're the people we've been waiting for. The city is not going to change on its own. And we have to take responsibility for that change. And we've got to build enough power to do that. So Bridgeport Generation Now, builds power using the tools of community organizing to dismantle systemic corruption and systemic racism so that we can build the just, equitable, and livable Bridgeport that we all know is possible. And so to young people, I say, we need you. We need you here. It's going to be like, it's all hands on deck, basically. No one's going to fix Bridgeport. No one's coming to save us. We have to do the work ourselves.
Jamim Davis, it's been a pleasure to talk with you, co-director of Bridgeport Generation Now. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Also, Brian Lockhart, reporter covering Bridgeport for the Connecticut Post and Hearst, Connecticut newspapers. Brian, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. After the break, we're going to learn more about the program that Senator Dennis Bradley is alleged to have defrauded. You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been learning about the corruption charges against State Senator Dennis Bradley and how this latest story affects the city of Bridgeport. Bradley is the third elected official from the city to face federal corruption charges in recent years. Ironically, as we heard Brian Lockhart mention from the Connecticut Post, his arrest came during the same week the former city police chief, Armando Perez, started his federal prison sentence after he and the city's former personnel director, David Dunn, also in federal prison, pled guilty last October to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and making a false statement to the FBI. The two men participated in a 9-month conspiracy to deceive the city by secretly rigging the selection process for a permanent Bridgeport chief. Joining us now on Zoom is Mark Pasniokis. He's Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. We wanted to talk more about this Clean Elections program. Mark, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
So the irony here is that Senator Bradley allegedly misused funds or misled to get funds from the Citizens Election Fund. It was an anti-corruption clean elections measure. Can you give us some background on the program?
Sure. The program was created in 2005, largely in reaction to the resignation and eventual guilty plea in federal court by Governor Rowland. One of the ironies is that his scandal had really nothing to do with campaign finance. It was a bid rigging scandal involving a state contractor. But, in 2005, Rowland's successor, Jody Rell, wanted to make a strong statement against the influence of state contractors, the influence of big money in general in campaigns, and advocates who have really been working for years on campaign finance reform, seized the opportunity, and together with a Republican governor, they did pass what at the time was really a groundbreaking program to provide the public financing of campaigns for statewide state office as well as state legislative races.
Has it been a successful program, Mark, would you say?
There's you can have a great debate on that. It is a very popular program. Really, almost every legislative candidate in a competitive race uses the public financing system. And one of the benefits of that clearly has been independence from lobbyists. Prior to the public financing program, really an alarming amount of money was raised in Hartford from people and interest, people who lobby the legislature and interest before the legislature. There was also a reliance on state legislative leadership PACs. And one consequence of that is it would undermine the independence of rank and file legislators from time to time. So I think most people would say this is a very healthy change in Connecticut politics. One of the other benefits is the underpinnings of this program is you have to raise money to qualify. You have to raise anywhere between, you can take contributions of anywhere between $5, and originally it was $100. Now the maximum is $270 to qualify. And you have to raise it, most of it, in your district. So again, that pushed these legislators away from being reliant on lobbyists in Hartford to going back to their districts and doing grassroots organizing. And I think almost everybody would say that is a very healthy thing. At the statewide level, unfortunately, this public financing program exists in a world where it's in conflict with federal laws and case law, which really undermine it. And what I'm talking about is two things. One is the unlimited flow of independent expenditure money, or you hear them referred to as super PACs. And so you have people operating in two very different worlds. You can have a publicly financed candidate for governor who can accept a maximum of $270, but yet that same candidate can be supported by somebody who spends $1 million on an independent expenditure group. And then the other conflict is between state and federal law. And and ironically, this goes back to Jody Rell's original concern about influence of state contractors. State contractors are barred from contributing to state campaigns. However, federal law allows them to contribute. And the state parties operate under state and federal law. And every statewide election coincides with a federal election. People are running for Congress when people are running for governor and state rep and so forth. And one consequence of that is federal law requires that any money that the state parties expend to turn out the vote that benefits congressional candidates, U.S. Senate candidates, you got to go by the federal rules. And guess what? There's no ban on state contractor money for these federal rules. And there was a huge conflict in Governor Rowland's 2014 reelection. The Connecticut State Party ended up paying a $325,000 settlement because there was an allegation that there was the money flowed back and forth between the state and federal accounts, and a lot of the federal money, which was raised by state contractors, benefited Governor Malloy. Governor Malloy was not directly implicated, but the state party paid what was then and remains the record $325,000 to settle that case.
We just have a few minutes left, Mark. I wanted to focus in on this Senator Bradley story. Do you think it's unusual for the feds to get involved with this state elections enforcement issue? How do you read it?
Yes, there is a piece that is missing in the public right now, is the question of why this became federal. This was a significant election enforcement issue, as your previous guest talked about. There were complaints filed, elections enforcement investigated, and they denied Senator Bradley his general election grant. So yeah, that's the question of why did this become federal? Were they looking at something else in Bridgeport? This comes at a time when there were other things going on in Bridgeport, which you also talked about with the police chief and whatnot. But I don't know. I mean, you read the indictment, and there's clearly, as alleged, a federal jurisdiction in wire fraud. But anytime you use sort of a text or anything like that, and if you're doing anything illegal, you are subjecting yourself to federal wire fraud allegation or charge. But yeah, there was nothing in that amendment indictment that jumped out at me and said, aha, this is why the feds were looking at it. This was not referred to federal authorities by the Elections Enforcement Commission. They were doing their own investigation. And their typical path in these things, when they refer something for criminal investigation, it's to the chief state's attorney's office. It's not to the feds. So bottom line is, I don't know why this became a federal issue. I would push back at the suggestion that this is racial. The feds certainly have a strong history in Connecticut of investigating public corruption involving elected officials. We have several mayors, all white, a governor. They really upended a congressional campaign a couple of years ago. It didn't directly involve the candidate, but it did involve this campaign. So I would be hard pressed to see a pattern of racial animus in how the feds pick their targets. I'm guessing there was something in Bridgeport they were looking at, and whether they thought this would connect to it, that's just something we can only speculate about at this point. But again, when you read that indictment, it reads like a state elections enforcement case, not really a big federal corruption case.
So I guess that means we'll stay tuned to see what else comes out of Bridgeport in the next few weeks and months. I want to thank Mark Pasniokis, who's covered a lot of these corruption stories in Connecticut in his time as a politics reporter. He's Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. Mark, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it.
And thank you for having me.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchil. Today's show was produced by Carmen Baskoff. Robin Doyen-Aiken was on the phones today. Kat Pastor is our technical producer. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to have Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro on the show. President Biden has released his federal budget proposal. She now holds the chairmanship of the House Appropriations Committee. We'll talk with her tomorrow and take your questions too.